As growth and efficiency seem to be central to most organizations, many are turning to innovative technologies to enhance their go-to-market strategies. And GenAI is undoubtedly the one that we hear over and over as the new disruptor and savior. GenAI has the potential to revolutionize revenue generation, customer engagement, and improve operational efficiency. However, harnessing its full potential requires mature and well-prepared go-to-market data foundation. In this episode, we'll explore the potential of GenAI in successful go-to-market strategies. We'll discuss the current state of go-to-market readiness, the challenges that organizations face, and the best practices for building and implementing effective GenAI applications. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revenue Lounge podcast. I am your host, Randy Likas, and joining me today is James Underhill. James is Senior Director of Sales Innovation at MongoDB. He's responsible for building a modern tech stack internally at MongoDB and has tangible and practical implementation examples of things that he's built, things that he's seen has worked really well. But he's also going to share how we should think about the strategy and the intention and how that's critically important before building anything. James, welcome to the Revenue Lounge. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, Randy. Thanks so much for the intro. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, James, I was doing a little bit of research on you prior to this, and you got a really interesting background. So currently, you're doing RevOps and Sales Ops at MongoDB. Prior to that, you're doing revenue operations at Twitter. But you're a data scientist, data engineering guy, right? Typically not what you see in most Sales Ops roles. So I'd love to just learn a little bit more about your journey. Maybe start with prior roles in data analytics and how that evolved to your current role.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting. I think a lot of people like to adopt a label of, I'm a finance person or a salesperson or whatever. I tend to shy away from those types of labels. I think of myself as a generalist and really just a problem solver. I studied systems engineering in university. People ask, what is systems engineering? A lot of it is operations research, but a lot of it is figuring out the right question to answer. How do we think about this problem as a system of things with dependencies and solve those things? Mm-hmm. And I built up more of a technical skill set kind of coming into my first couple of roles. And what I really though wanted was to figure out where I could make a business impact. And when I joined MongoDB, it was at the right stage of growth where they needed somebody who could be a generalist and work on lots of different things and had a set of skills that enabled me to create more leverage for other parts of the organization, which end up being technical skills in setting up data infrastructure and automated reporting and a lot of things that early stage companies just don't really have. Mm-hmm. But as I grew over the course of MongoDB, I became more of a domain expert in go-to-market. And I tell a lot of people who are mentoring or coming up, I think there's a lot of magic in the convergence of different skill sets. When you really understand how to be customer-centric or you understand go-to-market, but you have some technical acumen, you can be a lot more effective than if you just come from something at a single angle. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like I've grown, my career at Mongo has grown in that lens, and my team called it sales innovation. It's very atypical and non-traditional. We have a product function that does internal tooling. We have an engineering team that's aligned to, now 2 engineering teams that are aligned to my function that build internal tools. We also have come with some of the more traditional buckets as well. Mm-hmm. But I think my background lends the ability to be a little bit more flexible to wherever the needs of the business have kind of taken us. Yeah. And so that's been where a lot of my journey has been able to go. But it makes things fun when you don't get pinned down to one label necessarily. You can go in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, no, that's great. So everybody's talking about GenAI today. I mean, you can't turn to a newspaper or anything, and everybody's talking about it. And they're all talking about it in the spirit of being more efficient, being more effective. And we'll get into that, right? But what I want to talk to you first off is maybe some of the organizational priorities and considerations. I heard you say on a prior podcast that people are too quick to think about solutioning for what's in front of them, the day-to-day challenges. And it's more important to think strategically, what are the big rocks as an org that we want to focus on? Mm-hmm. Or maybe as opposed to what's in front of them. So establishing strategic priorities are super important. Can you talk a little bit about how do you map maybe some of the things that you build back to those strategic priorities and before you think about ever building a solution?
Yeah, totally. I think that's super important. And I will say my background and my role, what I think makes it most unique when I talk to other people in the ecosystem is that I manage an ops team and a product team. And those two functions exist on opposite ends of a continuum. Where product is very much thinking, product is the analogy some people use is the greenhouse versus the operating room. The greenhouse is how do we create this ecosystem or atmosphere that is very conducive to ideas taking hold, growing, being forward-thinking, being very intentional. Mm-hmm. And ops is more of let's make sure the ship doesn't sink and we're reacting to all these external things. we're reacting to an earnings call, we're reacting to a new strategy, we're reacting to a problem or a fire drill. And I think the convergence of those things is what makes an effective go-to-market technology team, because you can't really just live in the greenhouse and be like, I'm going to ignore the fire that's going on. But if you don't think critically and intentionally about the future, then you're not going to be able to plan appropriately for it. And particularly, you're not going to be able to scale. And so your question is like, how do you think about the important areas that you would want to apply something like GenAI? There is a lot of buzz. And the first thing I normally will talk about with folks is like GenAI is a tool like any other tool, and that label is misused constantly. You see products that are like, our AI powered thing, like it's not an AI powered thing, it's just on a timer. Like the label is misused super often. The way I would think about it is really any business design problem. At Mongo, we happen to have an offsite 2 4th of Julys ago, or the beginning of July, where we just went through our biggest business problems. And it has to be solution agnostic to start. Where are the areas that we think we can open up bottlenecks in the business? And we just mapped out, starting with, okay, let's think about acquisition, let's think about expansion, let's think about retention. And then once we mapped out like the use cases, then we started to map out the personas to there. And then we're like, okay, now where can GenAI actually effectively move the needle? And we landed on retention and customer success because a lot of the data that we had there, and I'm happy to go down and talk more about that. But like to highlight that point is, we started solution agnostic, like what are the biggest business problems? And then figure out, okay, now GenAI as a solution is not panacea. It can't solve everything. And I think some people it's a mistake to try to use it to be able to solve any arbitrary problem. And we had to make sure that we're aligning the right problem and being intentional that it was a problem that was big enough that we wanted to solve so that it'd be meaningful.
So when you have a meeting like that where they come together, I'm just curious, what's that consist of? Are you in the room with like a CRO and the head of success, or is it like a sales ops thing where you're funneling what you're hearing in the business? Curious to just understand the organizational alignment around this, and who are your business partners that you're working with for something like this?
Yeah, so for us, CRO, head of CS, we have folks from our biz ops and our CIO. If you're gonna do this properly, GenAI, and we can definitely go in this direction, but GenAI is very new. There's a lot of things you got to get right in terms of like legal, security, data, as well as being aligned on what you want to do.
Right.
And I think like you're not going to be able to solve those problems like as a go-to-market ops team. You really collaborate with other areas of the business, procurement, IT. So we really had to get everyone on board. Like, okay, let's talk about the problems. Now, what resources do we have to put in place? What kind of protocol do we have to put in place? I'll say one thing that MongoDB did very well is Dave, our CEO, put together like a mandate initially, like basically saying AI is going to transform our business, and any internal initiatives need to be prioritized. And we established SLAs around like what it was going to be for like security review and like what it would take for teams to get access to tooling. And that accelerated everything a lot, because otherwise there's not like an immediate business urgency around it. And I don't think we would have been able to really mobilize as quickly as we did until we had that mandate. But it was very cross-functional even at that very initial meeting, and it was driven from the exec level.
And what falls out of that meeting? Is it like, okay, we know our priorities, and then we go sort of work async on some things and come back together? We'd love to understand, coming out of that big strategic meeting, you've got now your priorities. What happens next?
Yeah. So the big thing that came out of that initial meeting was we need to create a proof point of showing that this can work. Like, we're not going to mobilize significant resources. We establish a top 10 every year, and that's how we determine really where we're going to put a lion's share of resources. Like, we're not going to pull things away from those projects until we can determine that there's materiality here. And so we established a kind of proof of concept of what we wanted to do, and then we figured out across the teams that needed to be aligned where there needed to be resources in terms of like security, IT, legal, my team, development resources, where those were going to come from, and establish a timeline of, okay, by this date we wanted to be able to address this use case, and I can talk about that, was be able to address a technical question responder. And then we wanted to be able to demonstrate utility of that tool by another date, so then we could make decisions about investment.
Cool. You talk about the potential of AI really being broken down, and I think, if I'm paraphrasing you here, so two buckets, right? One is around time savings, where maybe you've got a really defined process, and we want to help maybe save time in that process. And then the second bucket would be, how do we use this as a mechanism to help guide or make micro decisions to put us in the right direction? Can you talk a little bit about what you mean there, and maybe some examples of each?
Yeah. I'd say at the most simple level, the two buckets are like that people would. This is kind of an ROI framework you would apply to anything. It's not just AI, but it's like time savings versus like upside, or automation or scalability. Like, how can I scale what somebody is doing? And there's a component for AI. There's a component of helping you figure out where you should be spending your time, or figure out what types of messages you should be sending that's more applicable to sales. But the high level framework is like time savings versus focusing on upside. And I think time savings is a kind of a cheap way to measure. It's a more effective way. It's an easier way to quantify something, but it can be kind of a cheap way to measure utility. So there's an ROI framework that has kind of two buckets. One is, how are we going to save time on this thing? And that one is tricky, because in order for that to actually be valuable, there has to be something else that you replace that time with. So just to say we're saving this many hours isn't necessarily a utility to the company. That tends to be the thing that's easier to manage, sort of easier to measure. So it's one of the first data points. It's a proper data point you can point to and say, hey, we saved 40 hours this week. That's a good start. But what are you going to do with those 40 hours is going to be the next question. The next bucket for any arbitrary framework is just like, well, what more can get done now that this thing is happening, like from a scale perspective and automation perspective? And when I think about AI and some of the ways that we're using it, is like, if you think about a salesperson's day, there's a lot of like mini decisions. You sit down, it's like, what's the first thing you're going to do? Are you going to check your accounts to update your forecast? Are you going to check like the lead funnel? Are you going to check some of your existing customers? Are you checking like any escalations? Are you checking in with your CS manager? What are you doing right now? What is the most important thing to do with your time? And as a human, you can really only focus on one thing at a time. And so if you have augmented perception of like, hey, the lead flow looks normal, but there's this one that is super important, and you should look at this first before you go on updating your forecast or doing these other things. That helps you optimize how you spend your time. That's one of the use cases for AI that I've been investigating. There's certainly a number of others in terms of just like making it easier to go through the day-to-day motions of what you do. I think it can be dangerous to automate away completely the work that sales does, for a number of reasons. One just being, at least right now, it's super obvious to a buying persona, of which I am one, that you're being touched by AI. Or it's maybe contextually relevant. Like, you get an email, you're telling me I was a Boy Scout? Okay. Yeah, I was. Who cares?
Yeah, it's a difference between being personalized and being relevant, right? You want to err on the side of relevancy over personalization, right?
Yeah.
You think the ability to guide and make better decisions is probably the more valuable use case, I would assume, than the time savings, although the time savings does have value. But if you were to have to pick one camp, which one would it be?
For sure, it's the optimizing for the upside is the way I think about it. Like, time savings, I think say it's like it's a easy thing to measure, but it's like cheap. It's like, okay, so we're saving time. I mean, people should be spending time on certain things. There's some things that clearly you want to automate away, but a lot of things you should be spending time doing. Spending time with customers is for sure what you want to optimize time towards. But like, sometimes the preparation of doing that is really valuable in the quality of time that you're able to spend with customers. And so there's only to a certain extent that time savings really is meaningful. But like, when you're thinking about upside and just like scaling the utility of a single person, if you think about the unit economics of a single rep, and like that cost is going to be relatively fixed, but like the upside is, does not have a ceiling. And so if you can increase that ceiling by touching more people, being more effective at the people that you touch, just being more efficient with your research, or being more efficient with handling pipeline, then that's really where as an industry, like, AI people want to be able to use AI, and I don't think tools are quite there yet. But that's really like where the value realization is.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think I'm dating myself, but I once had a VP of sales tell me like, so what, you're going to save 3 hours a day? That's just going to give my reps more time to go play Angry Birds, right? This is way back when, which is just, you know. All right, so let's transition a little bit and talk about data. So what do you think about the current state of go-to-market data and maybe its readiness to be utilized effectively in a Gen AI program? What does data readiness really entail when it comes to thinking about this?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of lenses there. And first I'll say like people, all over LinkedIn or all over the industry are kind of speculating right now, like where are the Gen AI apps? Like why am I as a business person not seeing more value of Gen AI apps today when there's so much buzz about, iterative improvement of GPT or other LLMs? And I think there's a couple bottlenecks in the process that are preventing like that application layer for really generating value. And in my experience, one of them is data. And so I give some examples, like if you think about how data is structured and where it lives in the go-to-market stack, you have probably a number of silos. A lot of that is getting broken down by the data lake or the data warehouse right now, but you've got like your segment, your Salesforce, maybe your product data, and there's PLG tools that are trying to break that down. When it comes to LLMs, the tricky thing is access and like this concept of like authorization for Gen AI apps. And so like a simple example is we started building a chatbot that would answer questions about the product. And at first it was very simple to load data into this chatbot RAG operation that we were running because all of our technical documentation is completely public. And so that was like, we were really rocking and rolling. And then we started to get into other data sources where it was like, well, we've got like this marketing take on like competitors, or we have some other internal documentation on this thing, but this is not, it might be viewable to people within the company, but it's not meant to be viewable to an external audience. And then as you went into different use cases beyond the technical documentation, like maybe our parental leave policy or specific comp related policy or other things that we wanted our employees to have access to, like that level of access control became very interesting, and we didn't really have the systems or mechanisms to really understand. Even like people would write documentation and it wouldn't be clear like what the intended audience is. It would just be within like a high spot folder or something, and that high spot folder was permission to a certain set of people. Yeah. But maybe like if you were thinking very intentionally, like if somebody could just search and this would be relevant to that search, is that the same audience that you want it to be? Like I think people haven't had to ask the questions of like, the thing about like GenAI is it enables a really powerful use case people are calling enterprise search. And that's like, I can search across like Slack, Google, Gmail, our internal wiki, Highspot, whatever.
Yeah.
And it's just not really clear like who should be able to see what. People haven't really been confronted with that, and it needs to be very clear. And so what we had to do is like I had a guy on my team put together a spreadsheet with all of the sources that we wanted to put to the knowledge base of our tool, and we had to document like where they were, where they came from, and who was going to be able to have access to them. And that was a very manual process. I think that's something people have to do in order to get started. Like otherwise you're just very limited to public domain information. And yeah, it's just like most information sources, people haven't quite asked the question yet, like should this be public? Or should this only be managers? Or the access control settings haven't really been tightly defined. I think I'll add one other thought to that, which is maybe something that's practical to some folks listening to this, is like when you share a Google Doc with somebody, like maybe you have a memo that's detailing like a new policy or something. Mm-hmm. Maybe you say, make this public to my organization and I'm going to copy the link and I'm going to send it out to these 10 people. And I'm going to make sure that they're going to see it because I'm going to email it and I'm going to link it to them, and I want them to be able to share that link with other people. Is the content of that information, like technically you have provisioned it for everyone in the org, right? Mm-hmm. Like you've said shareable to everyone in my org. But if somebody searches for it, should it come up? Like, is that what you want? And now there's settings in Google actually to enable that. But these are the types of questions, like when you're preparing GenAI apps, there is this like really important concept of access control. And like when you have the ability to search for anything, you can see things that maybe weren't intended for you. But like a lot of people build with like security by obscurity. It's just like no one's gonna find this, but like they technically have access to it. Well, now people are gonna find stuff. And so you got to be really prescriptive about these people should have access, these people should have not. A lot of those rules are not yet written. And so that's one of the things that's slowing down the release of applications.
Yep.
And it's something that we have to work really closely with security to make sure that secure, information about customers, for example, should be known to like the rep who supports that team,
Yep.
but not necessarily any arbitrary person at the company.
Yeah.
So these are some of the things that like need to be figured out before we can really start accelerating application development.
Yep.
Yeah, it's not an easy problem to solve.
No, it isn't. And one of the things that we hear quite often from companies as it relates to their go-to-market data, their sales data, right? Is they get frustrated because a lot of the sales tech out there right now will silo what they collect from reps in their own application, not necessarily write it back to Salesforce as your source of truth. So is there a way around that? Like, that's fine. We'll just put everything in the data lake and then we'll worry about it. Or how important is making sure that, Salesforce is that system of truth when you think about all these other applications that maybe a rep might use as part of their workflow?
I think it's a good question. I think a lot of it speaks to like, there's a question of GenAI natively embedded in tools where you are engaging with features, like the GenAI tools that are embedded in Zoom right now, or natively in Salesforce, or natively in a forecasting tool, or Wiki. Like, all of these tools are gonna be released. Even LinkedIn now has like their little like beta AI thing. It's like, tell me more about this, and I think it's kind of useless. But like, the problem with the native AI tool is the silo effect. A lot of the value that you're looking for comes to the convergence of the data across multiple tools.
Yeah.
Which is why I think there is space in the AI landscape for these like abstractions that run at a level above where the actual tool is. And there's companies that are starting to do that already. I think in terms of the data, my data infrastructure background is just like, it can be very expensive to warehouse lots of unstructured tech data. MongoDB is particularly good at that from a document model perspective, but people are going to want to figure out ways, like data warehouse isn't maybe necessarily like the best place for unstructured text, and maybe there's other ways of doing that. But I think my high level note is like, there is a big space for both embedding simple AI features within the tools that you're already using, as well as abstracting that and creating workflows for use cases that combined data from the CRM, data from a segment or a product-based signal. I think there's maybe some of the more powerful use cases come from that abstraction layer.
Yeah. One of the things I've heard you talk about is how sales ops or RevOps should think about themselves and their role, right, and purpose. So if I'm summarizing correct, like the goal of sales ops should be all about helping drive productivity, right? And the sales ops has to figure out a way to be able to scale, to be able to create that productivity, but also scale that productivity. And so a lot of this is about building product for internal customers and productizing like your function. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean there?
Yeah, I think advice to anyone who's coming up in their career, whether they're in go-to-market ops, RevOps, sales, is think about what the mission is at your company. Most of the times that's clear. If it's not, maybe that's a problem. But boil that down and work with your management to figure out like, what is your goal as a team and as a function? And for myself, that's changed over time. And particularly as we left like the zero interest rate era and we came into an era where we're more focused on profitable growth, a lot of those goals started to change. And I think to your question about thinking about maybe more of a product function, that comes from the change in priorities of let's hire a ton of sales resources, put them into the go-to-market machine that we've had, and we can get consistent unit economics from these increased people, but we're also increasing costs linearly too.
Yeah.
Versus how can we enable product to be able to maybe scale a smaller number of reps, or just maintain or grow at a lower rate in terms of headcount, but scale the unit economics of each of those people. And I think like ops teams are ops teams. Like they can be complemented with product, but when I talk about like product and design thinking, it's really just thinking, like taking a step back to say like, what does success look like here? What is success going to look like in 6 months? And am I pointed in that direction? Because it can be really easy to get bogged down in the weeds of the day-to-day.
Yeah.
This person is screaming at me to do this thing, and so I'm doing it. Versus, you know what, someone who's really upset about this because it affects their specific comp plan, but maybe that's not an important goal for the company. And I need to reorient what I'm doing because I have the ability to affect this other thing. And that's like it's a design thinking exercise to kind of establish what those OKRs are that you really need to hit. And this is something that your manager should help you with.
Yeah.
It's a good conversation for an early employee to prompt with their manager, like, how can I cut through the urgent versus the important and make sure I'm focused on the urgent and important?
Yeah.
Because I think in particular when you're working in go-to-market, there's just always a sense of urgency for things, right? There's never lack of urgency, but there's sometimes ops teams that are getting pulled in the direction of where there's just a lot of noise.
Yeah.
That can be dangerous because you really only have so much resources, and ops is a cost center. So you don't have people sitting around hanging out with extra time. So you really need to be mindful where you focus those resources. So that's what I meant in that note about thinking like a product function is maybe not everyone's building product. I do think that product helps to scale sellers.
Yeah.
But think about like really what your job is and be intentional about doing that thing.
Once I think reps here or leaders here that we've got a function here that can build these things for us, there's probably no shortage of ideas where people are coming to you and saying, can we build this and can we build that, right? And to your point earlier about like it gets really easy to get bogged down. How do you say no? What do you use to be able to say no on a lot of these probably requests that you're getting over and over again?
The good idea fairy. Why don't we do this? Why don't we just change this thing? I think it's like the way to say no is just no. And that's super important. I think like you as a leader or the person who is in a position of making those decisions have to have a really good idea. You have to have a really strong conviction, I'll say, in the direction you're taking. There has to be like a really strong why behind it. I think it can be easy to, when you're working, particularly building like internal tools or internal products, you sit next to your stakeholders. And so when someone says, I think we need to build this, it can be tempting to be like, this is an easy win to build this thing because this person is the person I'm trying to help and they're telling me to do this, so I'm just going to do that. But you really have got to have, like, you have to think like 3 questions deeper, like, well, why is that going to help? And then why is that going to move the bottom line? And why is this related to the company objectives? And so when you get all these good ideas, and the reality is like a lot of these things, like I joke about the good idea fairy, like you can get many good ideas that are not related to the primary objective that you need to be focused on.
Right.
And so like you need to be able to defend that this is the primary objective. Like if we could do all of them, that would be incredible, but just the reality is that you can't. And so you got to be protective about what you can do, because focus is what creates results. Same thing in sales. You don't just, spread your attention across thousands of accounts. You focus on the ones where there's opportunity.
Right.
And in a product org, you're going to focus the use cases that have the most value.
Yeah.
And so the way you say no is, you point to the roadmap of this is the thing that makes the most sense.
Yeah.
Now, not everyone, just a note that I've learned, like, not everyone thinks that way and sees that way, and everyone has different motives and incentives. So you can fully have strong conviction in an idea and feel that you're well-grounded in logic about why you're doing something, and people can totally still completely disagree with you. Sometimes maybe even like a visceral disagreement. And that's something that you should expect and be ready to defend. But ultimately, if you're owning a product, you're owning a function, you have to be able to take a stand for the use cases that you think are going to drive the most value and be able to defend them. You should expect people to challenge it.
It goes back to the why, right? Like why are we building what we're building right now? Why are we putting the resources behind what we're building right now? And I think sort of use that as the framework, if you will, to say, hey, good idea, not a priority right now because it doesn't ladder up to this objective. Maybe we can revisit it next planning process or something like that. Yeah. You started to go into this a little bit.
And when you can show.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna add, like, when you can show this is, and you should be able to show like a timeline of what we're thinking of doing. When you're able to show that, it does become more clear to stakeholders of, oh, I see this as the vision, and I see how my idea either aligns or doesn't align with it.
Yeah.
And so that's a powerful like storytelling tool to be able to aid that conversation.
Yeah.
But still not easy.
What does the internal marketing program look like for things that you're building? Do you have a cadence where maybe you're on the weekly sales call where you talk about some of the things that are coming that quarter? Like, would just like understand, how do you market that internally to the stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question. Building internal tools is interesting and fun in its own way, in that it's like you wear a lot of hats. In a traditional software development organization, you've got like a product manager, you have a product marketing manager, you have technical program managers, you've got all these different roles that have like their set of things, and you have like in some cases a PMM, in some cases a different type of marketer that's helping you enable or market to your set of stakeholders or your user base. Internally, it's like you kind of just wear all of those hats. Enablement and rolling things out, particularly at an organization as 1,000+ sellers, I can't begin to explain like how important it is and how often I sometimes overlook it. Because obviously in my mind, I'm like, this is clear how you use this thing and why you should use it. But if your goal is to make somebody more productive and they don't use it, then you haven't achieved that goal, even if that thing is, in theory, the exact tool that they need, right? So it's like the mission isn't accomplished until somebody's getting value out of it, and that's important to not forget.
Yeah.
The question around how is super difficult. I think the communication cadence of one to many, or in some cases many to many, when you're dealing with lots of sellers who are your audience, they can just become totally overwhelmed with news, new changes to Salesforce, new changes to comp plan, new changes to new SKUs in the product. They're so overwhelmed with updates that you've got to be really intentional about how you're broadcasting your product and how they're meant to use it. The best thing to do is to make the product as intuitive as possible. And one thing that I really like to do is start out small with an alpha group of trial participants, like a closed beta, if you will, I guess it's an alpha. Closed beta. And ideally you want those people to be kind of like a champion persona. And as they start to get value out of it, then they're talking to all their buddies and friends. And that becomes a good way for things to start to spread. You can start to include more things, but keep it closed at first. And it kind of builds a sense of like, well, I want to try that thing. If you just try to drop something on people, they're like, well, at some point in my day, maybe I'll try it, but like maybe I won't. But you really want to get people who are respected to be able to be speaking to it and be giving you feedback. I think it's super important. And you also need to document very clearly and have clear escalation paths when people do have suggestions and critiques, because when people are taking time out of their day to give you a critique of the product, like, to me that is like that's a statement of love. It's like, if I didn't care about you, I would just be like, whatever. But if I care enough to actually say something about it, you should have an ear to listen to it. You have to be very thoughtful and intentional about the enablement rollout strategy, and be really mindful about what types of other communication is this audience getting, and like fit into that cadence. Like, don't overwhelm them with a rollout notification when there's a zillion other product things going on, right?
Or it's end of quarter, right? Like, you want to distract
It feels
them.
like all things that are obvious, but it feels like things are all obvious, but it's like very non-obvious in practice when you start doing things. There's just so much going on.
Can you share some insights into, I guess, as you're building some of these applications, I assume there's probably some things that it relates to, like trial and error, and maybe it's part of this closed beta that you're talking about, where you build something, it's not quite landing, or it's not getting the trust that you need from the reps in order to adopt it. How do you take that and evolve the process to come up with sort of an end product that does meet, like? So I'd love to hear some insights on what maybe things that you've built before that didn't land, and like how you went about sort of changing it.
So we actually put together a framework for releasing a POC and a proof of concept. And as part of that, we actually established like rejection criteria. So there's like acceptance criteria and like rejection criteria. So as we're putting together the POC, we're going through identifying the personas, the use cases, the required capabilities. We get to a minimum viable product scope, and then we release a POC. There's a specific thing that we're looking to achieve, and then we also clarify, like, if you might just say, if it doesn't achieve this, we're gonna scuttle it, or it might be like, if it looks like we're getting this signal, let's iterate. But if it looks like we're at something, it's not being adopted, or there's something measurable that we can see, we'll actually identify what it looks like if we should abandon this POC and move on to something else. And a lot of the reasons that we would abandon an idea, if it's technically not feasible, it's just not resonating with the reps. A lot of times, I think, particularly technical people they over-index on their ability to create value that the reps are going to actually utilize. One example is that we've done a ton of work around scoring for accounts. And in theory, this goes back to my point, until the rep is getting value out of something, it hasn't worked. And so in theory, you might be like, I've got this awesome data science model that tells me the best accounts. But in practice, a rep might look at a score and be like, I disagree with this. And I also, now that I've seen this and I don't think this is right, I don't trust anything else that comes from this score. And it's a total black box, so I don't know why you're telling me this is good. And so I'm not going to call this account. And I'm going to go on with my day, and I'm never going to use this again. And those are the types of things. One of the things we realized with scores, like we have to make it very transparent about, if we're going to say an account is good, you got to be clear about why. Anything that becomes a black box, sales isn't going to use, and we got to get rid of. And so we replaced a lot of our account scoring and account tiering based on that principle. And over time actually moved it to become we started with very complex machine learning to just simple heuristics around developer counts that align to the first principles of our ICP, that a rep can actually see and be like, oh, this has got 80 developers. I can look them all up on Sales Navigator. I can touch them. I can see them. I understand them. And now I'm going to action on it. And getting them to the action is what we wanted. And so there's an important piece of the POC of understanding what does it take to actually continue to move and iterate, and where do we need to stop and assess if this is worth our time moving forward. But I think it's important for a team to be comfortable saying that this is something that we should stop. Because if you can't do that, then you're never going to really test things that are innovative. And I named my team Sales Innovation because I wanted to move forward with things that were going to be innovative. And if you're doing that, there's going to be failures. And so you got to be comfortable with that. And I think it can be hard mentality, particularly in an ops organization, to say we spent a month on something that people aren't going to use. Maybe. But the next month you might spend time on something that becomes a super important tool that you wouldn't have gotten there without the testing and iteration process. So knowing when to stop is an important skill.
Yeah, 100%. And also allows you to free up resources on some of those other important projects that you've got in the queue as well.
Exactly.
You talked about the process that you all kind of went through in July, where everybody got together cross-functionally, we looked at priorities of the business. Not everybody who's maybe wanting to build these apps is going to have that type of an environment where it's structured and they've got the sponsorship and the visibility. What recommendations might you give if somebody has a really good idea that they think aligns to a business priority? What should they do? How do they go about approach that in terms of approaching a leader saying, I think I could solve this problem building this application? Any advice that you might give for that, for those that don't have the ability to align everybody up front?
It's a convenient question to ask for a revenue podcast because it's the same process as qualifying pain in a sales cycle, right?
Love it.
It's you're going to say, you don't have to go through a process of saying, well, technically we could do this, and technically we could do this, and we have the data for this. It's forget about that. If you're trying to, at some point you will need business alignment to start a new project or to get funding for a tool or to do whatever, but you just start with the pain and start with the articulation of this is what we get if we could do this thing. Or it's the positive business outcomes, negative business consequences. That's what I kind of align on. And every memo I wrote about things that we need to pursue, it comes down to that. It's pretty universal, and it literally is sales. This is why selling is so important. And a lot of times if I'm at a bar and somebody asks me what I do, I say I'm in sales. Because I might not be day-to-day working with our customers, but what I do at this level of my role is sales. And I think everyone has a component of wearing that hat, and you have to understand if you're going to get something done, you need to be able to articulate where we stand to gain and where could we stand to lose. That's the starting point. Just a couple of bullet. If you're right now thinking about, you have an idea of something you want to do, a couple of bullet points. What do we stand to gain, or what could be the consequences if we don't do it? And from there, you can kind of sharpen the pencil on the idea. But in order to actually do something, you will have to get alignment, to get budget, to get resources. But that's the start of the journey to get there.
Yeah, I love that. Great advice. What haven't I asked you right now about sort of Gen AI or the potential that gets you really excited? So like if time, resources, money wasn't an issue, is there a big meaty challenge out there that you think that you'd love to start sinking your teeth into?
I think, because something I think about a lot is the buying experience, because we just talk so much about how, from a go-to-market perspective, we're like, well, how do we make go-to-market better, easier, faster, stronger, whatever, with AI? But I think, what if we thought about the buying experience and work backwards? And I think it's super interesting because as much as AI is going to affect go-to-market, it's going to affect the other side of the coin too. Like people who are buying tools, in particular, software buyers, they get the most attention. If you think about like any industry, think of dollars per economic buyer. In software, it's probably one of the highest.
Yeah.
And so just based on the number of emails I get from vendors all the time, if you have the ability to scale that up, like almost infinitely at a very low cost, like what that experience looks like for me, I think that something that when I think about AI, I'm like, how is this going to change kind of like the human interaction and like the trust loop that exists between buyers and sellers? I think that like brands are going to be more important. I think that having a deep understanding of a buyer's pain is going to really matter. I think just sending somebody an email and being like, hey, you're in fintech and we have this type of a tool, do you want to talk? I don't think that's really ever going to be effective. I think that's going to go the way of like cold calling. Like no one picks up cold calls anymore.
Yep.
No one's going to respond to cold outbound anymore. And so it's almost like, I think trying to just scale up something that doesn't really, or has a low conversion rate, isn't really the way to go.
Yeah.
And so if you think like 2 steps ahead, it's like, how do you lean into being more human and anticipating what somebody might need?
Yep.
Or doing maybe things more manual, actually. Maybe it's like a step back and it's sending somebody snail mail instead of like a million emails, thinking about other ways to connect with people. That I think is going to be interesting. I think AI will save us all a lot of time, but when in terms of creating new relationships and building trust, I think we've got to step back to like really what makes us human, like empathy and understanding. Say the word trust again. But that's where I see the direction of things heading.
What you had just said there made me think about this. I was at the Forrester conference back in, I guess it was May, and they had presented some data on how most sellers or most buyers right now, like I think it was like 77% of them prefer not to they want to do their own research. They want to, their buying experience is so much different than having a rep get involved. And so they want to do all that research before they even contact the rep, right? And so to your earlier point about thinking about the buyer's process and how where they might have challenges in their own research, where a rep can add value as opposed to, writing them an email or give them a call and kind of interrupting their day. So I think that's really interesting. How can we use Gen AI to support the buying process that aligns with the sellers? How can the seller add value back to the buyer based on that? That's really, really interesting.
I was just going to give like an anecdote that I've talked about before, but I think is like very illustrative, is like the idea of a hotel doorman. If you're trying to figure out how to scale the hotel's back office, so to say, I mean, you could get rid of the doorman, you could put in an RFID reader, you could put in an auto greeter, you check in on the iPad, and in theory, people are so capable of doing everything that they could with the reception or the doorman or whatever. But like the reality is like you're gonna lose customers because a doorman creates trust. There's someone to talk to. It makes you feel safe when you're in the lobby. Like people aren't just like running in, going crazy. It's somebody to ask, hey, you know where I can get a good cup of coffee? Like when I'm as a buyer interacting with a sales rep, I expect them to be an expert in that space. It's not just that they're facilitating a transaction. It shouldn't be transactional. Right. I'm like, how are other companies doing planning? How are other companies doing segmentation? I want to understand, like, from your expertise, like, I want you to be valuable to me. And I think tools that lean into helping reps create more of the ancillary value that isn't just this like transactional system of let me show you a product demo, let me qualify your pain, now let me move you to POV or whatever, but actually like make me feel like I'm doing my job better because I'm interacting with you. Tools
Yeah.
that do that, I think, are going to be successful.
Yeah. I love it. Look, I could talk to you for another hour on this stuff. I really like geeking out on this, but I want to transition to a different part of the podcast, which is a little bit more personal, right? Would love to hear what's your favorite part of working in, whether you call it sales ops or RevOps or sales innovation. Like, what's the favorite part of your job? Like, what do you enjoy the most?
I think, and in a way, I'm kind of talking to a younger version of me in this answer. But if you're somebody who's like, you feel like you have become adept at maybe like solving problems, like working with data, but you like like you like working with different people. One of the benefits of go-to-market ops as a function is that you're really tied to the heartbeat of a company, which is like the revenue engine. There's a lot of roles, and I've had different roles across different companies where you just don't really, you're isolated that, the quarter could be beginning or ending, you don't really know. You're focused on some other projects that are just running parallel to kind of everything else. Whereas like go-to-market ops, you're just so intimate to the health of the company that you get exposed to really, really important pieces of the business and important people in the business. And I've always viewed that as an accelerator. And I had a professor in college that said, if you want to be important at a company, get as close to the money as possible. And he was like, that basically ends up being sales and everything around sales.
Yeah.
And obviously, there's lots of other important pieces of the company. But if you're, up and coming in your career, and maybe you're like a generalist like me, and you're looking for an area to create impact, go-to-market ops, RevOps, sales ops, whatever you want to call it, is super intimate to some of the most important pieces of the business, and it is a way to fast track your career and get access and FaceTimes to some of the most important executives of the company. So that's what I enjoy most about the function.
What's the flip side to that question? So what's the least favorite part of your job? Or maybe ask a different way, like what's hard about your job?
Yeah, I mean, what's hard? I mean, I think like the only things that are worthwhile are hard things, but there's a deep level of ownership and accountability in this role. So it's like in other lifetimes at other companies, you're working on a project, but maybe the success or the failure of that thing is not intimately tied to the success of the company, which is something that I don't want, right? You want to be intimately tied to the success of the company, but the burden of taking on true ownership of like the revenue engine is a lot. Like that level of ownership is really intense. I think what you get out of it is a really deep, valuable experience of building teams, being able to coach and develop leaders. It's an accelerated learning track, but when something goes wrong, you got to fix it. It's not like there's a problem with the revenue engine, we're going to solve it next week. Like we're going to solve it right now.
Yeah.
And that's the way you got to think about things. And what that means is you can start to look around, you see other people. I mean, sometimes you look around the office, you're like, wow, everyone's sitting around having a nice lunch. That could be fun. But, I'm gonna be heads down for the next few hours because I gotta be. So the intensity is high.
Yeah.
But I think like that is not a bad thing.
Yep.
Like that, I would say that is not a bad thing. It depends on the person and what you want.
You strike me as the type of person who kind of thrives on that, right? You lean into that responsibility, right, and challenge.
I think you to be in this role for so long, you have to lean into the fire, and I think it really shapes the way that you kind of think of the world, and it's such an intimate like being as part of the go-to-market organization at Mongo and in general. It becomes like a religion. Like when we talk about accountability, what it means, you become obsessed with it, and you see it in all sorts of other ways in how you interact with other businesses or other people. And like even sometimes you'll have a friend that somebody will say like, oh, I was late because like the subway was running late. Like, wrong answer. You were late because you didn't plan for redundancy in time because that wasn't important. And maybe it wasn't important, that's okay. But being accountable means like looking yourself in the mirror being like, could I have affected the outcome of this? And obviously, like, it's not good to project that on your friends and family, but you start to like see the world in a very particular way when you come up in a culture of radical ownership and accountability.
Yeah. You know, you're kind of on the bleeding edge here, developing a lot of these applications that I think we're going to see more of, but there's not a lot of, examples, I guess, that you could turn to. So I'm curious, like, where do you turn to for sort of inspiration and advice? Do you have like certain peers that you reach out to? Do you look to the analyst research? We'd love to understand when you're looking for inspiration or ideas, where do you turn?
A lot of ways to get ideas. For me, like, I don't really read a lot of like analyst research, or like I read a lot of Twitter, and I follow like a lot of tech. I follow like a bunch of VC newsletters on tech, and I get some inspiration from there. But I just really I kind of have a thought experiment that I like to do, which is like, I put myself in the position, starting with like a buyer. I'm like, I wonder what it would be like in like 5 years or 10 years, and just like start from there. Like, what if I was in their shoes? What do I know now about this experience? What might it be? And I just go through these like thought experiments in my head as I'm going for a walk. And that's where I kind of like, when you are thinking about things, I think to go for a walk is really valuable.
Yeah.
As your body is moving, you're just more creative. And I just kind of take it back to first principles. I'm like, okay, as a buyer, how am I going to be building new relationships with people? How am I going to be discovering new things? Is it going to be through the mediums that I am now, or a different medium? And if it was a different medium, what would it be? You start to ask yourself these questions, and like the answers can be whatever. You're like, maybe I'm finding out things through social media. Maybe people are showing up to my house, like delivering me pizzas and telling me like, you should be buying SaaS software. I don't know. And you start to think like, well, what are the likelihoods of these things happening? But like, for me, it's like a lot of thought experiments while I go for long walks. Yeah. But certainly like listening to podcasts is also great. A lot of the good ones are like the big VCs will put out podcasts where they talk about tech, and I think it can be powerful to see like, oh, this tool does this thing. Okay, well, in my world, how could that be used? And that starts to spark some creative juices as well. I don't think there's any necessarily like right answer. I think different things work for different people, but trying to put yourself in the shoes of a future role and like thinking backwards, or starting with like, well, what can tech do and how's it evolving? And how does that affect like the main buckets of things that we're trying to accomplish in my world, and how could that help? Those are kind of two ways that I would think about it.
Yeah, great advice. What does James like to do outside of work? So like any passions or things you like to do to sort of decompress?
Yeah, so since the beginning of COVID, I've been taking French lessons. I do 2 hours a week with a tutor. And I think, so French is one, and then just weightlifting is the other thing that I do. Yeah. And I find both of them are like very therapeutic. One of them is like, I find like when I'm working out, I kind of just dissociate. Like, I've got my routines that I've just memorized. I can go through, pick up, put down, and just kind of like, just be in the moment and not be thinking about work. And like working out is very distracting. And then also like with French as language, there's a ton of value to that. Because number one, like as you're trying to speak a different language, you're not worried about anything else that's going around. You're not worrying about, your job or other things. You're super focused. Yeah. And it also builds just like a level of humility. Like as an adult trying to speak bad French to a guy on a Zoom call and like be like, yeah, actually you would say this, or that was totally wrong. Like, okay, cool. And I think as you get more mature in your career, you start to develop this idea of like, I'm a professional and I'm good at this. Yeah. And then suddenly you're presented with this information of like, actually I'm worse than a second grader at this thing. It starts to challenge like your ego and your idea of like, oh, am I smart? But I think that's like important. It's very grounding, because you have to realize that we're not all good at things. And in your career, when you people hit plateaus because they think that they're good at everything, and then the business changes or there's other changing conditions, and they're like, no, I know how to do this, but they don't. And so they're not approaching it from a mindset of, I need to continue to learn. Yeah. And so I think just being reminded repeatedly that you're not good at something, and just confronting that like builds a humility that is really helpful to continue to grow. And, I can order at a restaurant in France now, and sometimes they just look at me like, okay, but I definitely enjoy it.
Well, I just out of curiosity, why French? Did you take it in high school, or what made you decide to do French as opposed to any other language? No, yeah.
I had no background in French whatsoever. I just thought it would be fun. I just really enjoyed going. I've been to France many times. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And I'd always just felt like I was an outsider looking in. Like they had this cultural kind of like barrier, which was the language. And until you speak it, you're always kind of be on the outside looking in. And I was like, you know what? I've got a bunch of time in COVID. Why don't I start trying to learn this thing? And I just ended up really enjoying it. And I'm definitely not on the inside of that barrier, but it's given me a lot of perspective. And it's also just something that's, I think, fun to do. It's very, I would say also, our careers are very non-linear. Like what success looks like is often like nebulous. And so you can go in different directions and you're never really sure, am I progressing? It's not obvious, but I can spend a Sunday afternoon just learning French vocabulary or phrases, and I feel very fulfilled by that.
Yeah.
And it's like, it can be linear. Like literally you can put in time in something and just get something out of it, and no one can take that away from me. I'll know how to say those things. And it just feels like a really productive use of time it just feels very satisfying.
James, last question for you. What do you think, where are you going to be in 10 years, 15 years? Do you want to stay in RevOps, sales ops? Do you eventually want to take your go-to-market knowledge and lead a specific function? Like, where do you think your aspirations are?
I think the landscape of RevOps is evolving very quickly. And I think what sales means is evolving very quickly. And in particular, as cloud is becoming more popular, like the selling motions are going to change. And I think there are going to be people in a position to build like the modern go-to-market engine. And I think that engine is going to be designed by somebody who has the tech and sales experience, where you're able to understand like the power of product-led growth, as well as product-led sales, as well as outbound, and to kind of combine all those things together into like, there's just so much evolution in how SaaS is sold, and there's going to be like the stack is going to change over time. And I think as that changes, the role of RevOps or go-to-market ops is going to change. And I think it starts to become and look more of like a COO like style, like domain or scope. And I think like 10 years ago, we looked at like what RevOps was, and it was kind of like issue comp plans or like do something. But it's just become a much more, as there's been much more data and companies moving to consumption, moving to the cloud, it's become a much more important function.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious to see how it goes, and I want to be somebody that's involved in helping to define what great looks like for the modern tech stack.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to see where that goes. I think it's become more important over time. I'm making a career bet on that. So
yeah,
we'll see.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think we're going to start seeing more and more CROs of organizations who maybe have come from RevOps. They've got a complete understanding of the business for all the reasons you just outlined. James, I want to just say thank you for your time. Fascinating conversation. I know our viewers will really enjoy it as well. Thanks for joining me. And that's a wrap for today's episode of the Revenue Lounge.
Thanks so much, Randy.